Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. As always, a reminder, please join me on Locals. Join my mailing list, you find every other link down below the video. And today I am joined back by Scott Ritter, very grateful for his time. And yeah, hello Scott.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Привет everyone, that's what I will say from Moscow. And I'm not a spy. So let's start with my questions. Today, I wanted to ask you something that I have been wondering about this for quite some time. I believe if there is a war, every war has some kind of rules that cannot be crossed. Like you have to respect those rules, and you have to stay within those rules. Otherwise, there are consequences, right? Tribunals or courts or whatever it is. So watching this situation in Ukraine, I'm wondering, is there any kind of rule that has been respected in this situation, or they are breaking every single rule?
Well, I mean, we can start with the beginning. Russia made a case which, to defend their decision to send military forces into Ukraine under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Specifically, the case deals with preemptive collective self-defense. So from the Russian perspective, they had a legal right, and indeed they will say duty and obligation to intervene militarily. The collective West, including Ukraine, have rejected this. The United Nations has rejected this, but that is a political decision, not a legal decision. Let's just say that we have, there's legal controversy here about the legality of Russia's actions. But Russia's decision seems to be sustained more and more by the admission on the part of the collective West that they were in fact doing that which Russia accused them of doing, meaning using a peace process as a sham to build up forces to attack Ukraine. We have video statements of President Zelensky in 2019 saying, I will go to war in Ukraine, I will go to war in Donbass. This is a time when the Minsk Accords were still on the table. He's acknowledging he has no intention of fulfilling Minsk. And when you see that, Russia's case is becoming stronger and stronger for a legal justification for their decision to military intervene. So I think right off the bat, because what a lot of people say is that when you start a war based upon an illegal, that's an illegal war of aggression, everything that follows is by necessity illegal. Mm-hmm. So it's important that we start at the beginning. Russia started this war based upon legitimate, legally sound collective self-defense requirements that were brought about by 8 years of NATO Western Ukrainian aggression against the people of the Donbass. And clearly articulated intent on the part of NATO to use Ukraine as a military proxy to bring further harm to the people in Donbass and the people of Crimea. And that rather than allowing this threat to manifest itself in actions, Russia preempted it and moved in militarily. And if you take a look at Russia's goals and objectives early on, we now know that Russia wasn't trying to occupy Ukraine, destroy Ukraine. Russia was trying to compel Ukraine into a negotiated settlement. Russia invaded on February 24th. By March 2nd, they were already entering into negotiations. 3 negotiations in the first week of March, and finally a concluding negotiation in Istanbul on 1 April that was supposed to bring this war to an end. So Russia's actions that they took conform with the case they made for intervention, the elimination of the immediacy of the threat in an effort to seek a peaceful resolution to the problem. Everything Russia has done is conformed with the letter and intent of the law. Ukraine, on the other hand, was allowing itself to be used as a proxy by NATO to wage a genocidal war against the ethnic Russians. And I call it genocidal because, in April of 2014, Ukraine declared the ethnic Russian people of the Donbass and Crimea as terrorists. and they began an anti-terrorist operation that manifested itself in extreme violence, including stuffing 150 people into a trade union building in Odessa, setting on fire and cheering as 48 of them died. The rape and pillaging of Mariupol in June of 2014, and the violence that ensued since then. So the crimes are being committed by Ukraine, which is being backed by NATO and the collective West, who are empowering them with training, with political support, especially of a coup d'état that was in violation of sovereign Ukrainian law. I mean, a violation of the concept of self-determination. So when you do up a basic list of which side has the law on their side, and you do it fact-based, not the knee-jerk black and white stuff that the West wants you to buy into, where you have to assume at face value that Russia's actions were an unprovoked act of aggression. But when you really look at it, you realize not only did Russia articulate a case, but they've been acting in a manner which indicates that what they were seeking was indeed a rapid resolution of the war with minimal violence to achieve a peaceful outcome that was denied to them because of the other side's unwillingness to faithfully engage in negotiations. We see that Russia's on the right side of history. Russia's on the right side legally. And so now we take a look at what follows. How has Russia prosecuted this war? How has Ukraine prosecuted this war? Russia has bent over backwards to avoid civilian loss of life. I mean, tragically, thousands of Ukrainian civilians have lost their life in this conflict. But if you take a look at historically speaking, especially when we're dealing with large-scale ground combat operations in a European environment where you have dense populations, towns, villages, etc., that get caught up in the conflict. Historically speaking, civilian casualties and military casualties roughly correlate to 1 to 1. So for every dead soldier, there's a dead civilian. Let's look at a historical example. The American and French and British liberation of Normandy. The battles that were fought there in June and July of 1944. 60,000 French civilians were killed. A lot of people don't talk about that, but 60,000 French civilians were killed. And yet we call what we did a just campaign, a justifiable campaign, the liberation of France from the German occupier. And yet we killed 60,000 civilians. In Ukraine today, the Ukrainian, and that 60,000 number correlates to the total number of dead amongst the Germans and the Allies in that region. So 1 to 1 correlation. For every dead combatant, you get a dead civilian, roughly. In the conflict to date, Ukraine has probably suffered over 300,000 dead soldiers. The Russians have probably suffered between 35 and 40,000 dead soldiers. So we're looking at 340, 350, maybe 400,000, depending on the Ukrainians could have suffered even more. They just aren't counting their dead properly. So let's just say 350,000 dead combatants. Therefore, there should be 350,000 dead civilians, using historical examples. But instead, the number of Ukrainian dead is surprisingly low. I mean, we don't know the total numbers yet, but we're under 10,000, maybe just a little bit over 10,000, but it's not much larger than that. And so right off the bat, we have this huge deviation between the number of civilian dead, the number of combatant dead, and the historical precedent of 1 to 1. It's now far less than that. Let's say if you have 350,000 dead combatants, a 1 to 10 ratio would make it 35,000 dead civilians. We don't have that. We have 1/3 of that. So we're talking about a 3% casualty ratio instead of a 1 to 1. It's the numbers of dead are surprising. How did we get to this point? We know from Amnesty International, and we know from the Washington Post and others, that the Ukrainians are using the Ukrainian civilians as human shields. Almost every with some exceptions, most of the Ukrainian civilians that die because the Ukrainian government has put them in harm's way in violation of international humanitarian law, straight up using them as human shields. The Russians, on the other hand, we have, yes, there are some cases where, the Russians have killed civilians. War is hell, and you get collateral damage, and you get things that don't want. And who knows? Maybe some of those cases could manifest themselves into, individual war crimes. But you can't sit there and say, because you have an example of a Russian tank shooting on a civilian car, killing an old man and a woman, that Russia is prosecuting a war in violation of international humanitarian law, because the evidence is completely different. The Russians are going out of their way not to target civilian areas. It's very precise targeting within areas hitting critical infrastructure at a time designed to minimize human loss. When you lose people in those areas, it's because Ukrainian air defense has either missed the Russian missile and hit a building themselves, or deflected a Russian missile into a building. But when Russia's bombs hit their targets, the targets are of exclusive military character with minimal civilian loss. You take a look at the fighting in urban areas such as Mariupol. We know that the Ukrainians, especially the neo-Nazis, Azov, etc., were holding hundreds of Ukrainian civilians hostage in buildings that they had occupied from a military standpoint, basically daring the Russians to destroy the building. How did the Russians respond? They didn't destroy the building. Instead, the Russians fought through the Ukrainian defenses, suffering large casualties, to get to the civilians trapped in the building, to evacuate the civilians before launching the final attack on the building. This was repeated over and over and over again. So the Russians are not only complying with international humanitarian law, they are going above and beyond, because by humanitarian law, they didn't have to do that. Once the Ukrainians turned that building into a military object, which was impeding Russia's military objectives, then Russia has every right to apply the force necessary to eliminate that threat. And if the civilians die in the process, that is collateral damage. But the Russians are going out of their way to avoid collateral damage. The Russians are sacrificing the lives of their soldiers to save human lives. The Russians are capturing Ukrainian prisoners of war and treating them well. Not just your average Ukrainian. They're capturing Nazis, people with swastikas, with the tattoos, people whose cell phones show them committing horrific crimes against civilians, against Russian soldiers. And instead of executing them, torturing them, they bring them in and they treat them in accordance with international law. They provide them shelter, food, medical care, give them access to the International Red Cross. In many cases, they exchange them for Russian prisoners of war. The Ukrainians, when they do capture Russians, because we now know through video evidence that they execute a lot of Russians. They don't take them prisoner. They torture Russians. They do medical experimentation, castration on Russian prisoners. They beat them. And when they release them, the Russians are in horrific mental state and physical state. The bottom line is the Ukrainian government is waging a conflict in direct violation of every norm. They are using chemical weapons against the Russians openly. They have units where you have clearly identifiable people who are bragging about it, then they publish drone videos showing them using it. So they're violating, the chemical weapons, they're executing prisoners, civilians. They come in and they carry out cleansing operations where they grab civilians they accuse of collaboration and execute them. You have Ukrainian military people bragging. They say, when the war is done, you're going to have to do a census to find out how many people we killed, because we're killing them by the thousands, but we just dispose of the bodies.
Scott, can I interrupt you here?
Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt you. I
no.
normally don't. And that's why I actually asked that question, because why no one is reacting to exactly those chemical weapons? Like, I've seen those videos kept in the fridge somewhere. They are showing those Ukrainian soldiers on their TikTok accounts or whatever other form. Why no international, I don't know what is the organization, but there are international organizations who are responsible for not making this to be happening in the world, right?
Yeah.
This is breaking absolutely the law. No one is reacting. They are on the same cahoots. Is it like they are all in the same cahoots?
Yeah. No, you look, the United States has perverted the international community and international law. We've infected it with Russophobia. Russia is not, Russia has no rights. Russia is automatically assumed to be in the wrong. I'll give you an example specifically about the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, stationed in The Hague. They're the ones who should be investigating this. Let's go back in history and go to Duma, a suburb of Damascus. And the OPCW has what they call an information cell, part of their operations center. And the information cell's job is to monitor social media, monitor what's going on, to look for evidence of chemical weapons use. Now, they claim that that's their job. They do it and they ran. But what really happened is that this information cell and the operations center was working with Syrian opposition groups, including the White Helmets, which were specifically trained by the West to make these videos. And so these guys went out there and they manufactured videos trying to make the case that Russia or that Syria was using chemical weapons against its own people. They manufactured the evidence. And then the information cell went, oh my goodness, videos that they made with these guys. It's all fake. Videos, they write a paper, take it to the head of the OPCW and say, you must investigate. And so they initiate the investigation mechanism under international law with the support of Security Council. We go in, they blame Syria and they blame Russia, even though they're both blameless. It never happened. Now, that same information cell exists today. The videos are available. You've seen them. If their job is to scour social media, look for evidence of violations, they now have at least two. One video where people are bragging about producing this. They're in the refrigerators, the drones are going to operate it. You have faces, you have clearly identifiable features. They're Ukrainian. The other one showing a drone deploying these weapons, and it looks like they're killing people using these weapons. Why isn't the OPCW, why isn't this information cell taking this information, writing up a report, sending it up to the chain of command, and the head of OPCW demanding an investigation into Ukraine? Why is there silence? Because the OPCW is not, as Russia has long said, a impartial international organization. It is an organization that has been taken over by the United States, NATO, and Europe to pursue their singular policy of demeaning and undermining Russia. This is a fact. And you cannot expect the world to be doing the right thing. This is why we come back to why Russia has to win this war. Because the only way all of this can be broken down is for Russia to emerge victorious in a manner which discredits everybody. If Russia allows this war to be finished on terms that are less than a decisive victory, then none of this is discredited. They will all, in fact, claim victory, that they stood up to the Russian threat, etc. Russia needs to win. These forces need to be discredited. And I don't know if the OPCW can ever regain its credibility. From my perspective, they are a permanently tainted organization, not just because of what they did in Syria, but what's happening here, the silence that is manifest when you see clear violations of the OPCW's mandate, and the OPCW does nothing because people being killed are Russians, and Russians don't have any rights.
So there is no international justice system that actually can function and be respected.
No,
fair.
The justice system, unfortunately, for the international is going to be Russian justice. The Russians are investigating everything. And they know, I strongly suspect that the Russian intelligence service, who are very good, and when idiots put out a video that has their face, the Russians know who these people are. And at some point in time, these people will be either killed or detained by the Russians. And if they're detained, there will be a trial and the evidence will be put out there. There will be justice brought to bear. But the problem is, from the international community's perspective, we won't recognize that tribunal. We will say it's an illegitimate tribunal. We will say, whatever we can to minimize the guilt of the individuals being charged, and by extension, our own guilt in facilitating their work. But the Russians will know that justice was served. They will hold them to account, and these people will receive whatever justice Russian law allows for whatever crime they were committed if they're found guilty.
So I want to ask you a question that actually was addressed to you on my chat, on my live chat. I've asked this question, Andrei Martyanov, but I want to ask you your opinion. As those young people in Ukraine are being hunted now, everywhere pretty much, like I said, in the shopping centers, on the streets, you name it, and then they throw them onto the front line. I would like to know, Scott, how long this will go on. Is there any way that Ukrainian citizens can revolve this, can say no to it? What is the way to end this for those people?
Tragically, the most likely outcome is they're all going to die or be taken prisoner. Russia's getting ready to initiate what I believe is going to be a decisive offensive operation. I believe they've already begun the operation in limited form, shaping the battlefield. But pretty soon they're going to commit the bulk of their reserves that they've built up. And the end result is going to be massive quantities of dead Ukrainians. And any one of these young people that are caught up in this will probably be killed unless they're fortunate enough to surrender. That's the tragic reality. And I give little hope for a kind of popular revolt, because I think the dynamic that's going to emerge on the battlefield is going to be so violent and so quick that there isn't going to be any static period of time where Ukrainian soldiers have a chance to organize in a mutiny against their leaders. I think they're going to be too busy dying, surrendering, or retreating. I don't think there's going to be a period of time where they could sit there and get angry enough. But if there is, I think there will come a point where there's going to be a military revolt against Zelensky. When and we can go back to the situation that existed in the trenches in 1916, 1917 on the Eastern Front, where Russian soldiers just got tired. I mean, after the Brusilov offensive in I think October of 2016 or 1916, the Russian army lost its spirit. They weren't ready to die again in these numbers. And then the revolution came, and they just gave up. And eventually they just put their guns down and they walked home and they revolted. They got involved in the Civil War. The level of death that's going on right now, we just had General Saboli, he's the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, just spoke in Sweden last month. And he said, what's happening right now, NATO isn't prepared for. We never could imagine the violence that's taking place in Ukraine today, which is sort of funny because that was supposed to be their job. But they couldn't imagine it. They're not ready to fight it. It's so violent, it shocks them, the number of dead. If Ukraine has indeed suffered 300,000+ dead, understand this: during the entirety of Second World War, the United States, in fighting both Imperial Japan and Germany in large-scale ground combat operations, suffered 300,000 dead total for the entire war. Ukraine has suffered more dead in 1 year than we suffered in the entire war. That tells you something about the level of violence that's taking place. And it's only going to get worse. It's only going to become more violent. At some point in time, I believe the Ukrainian army is going to recognize that they're being sacrificed for reasons that have nothing to do with the security of Ukraine and everything to do with the promotion of American policy. And then the question is going to be asked, do we want to die for American policy? And the answer, I think, is going to be an overwhelming no. And at that point in time, there will be the collapse of the Ukrainian military, and Zelensky better run for his life, because the moment these soldiers feel that level of betrayal, they are going to pivot. They are going to march on Kiev, and they will kill him if they catch him. And that's the direction we're heading to, because this is an unsustainable war. And unfortunately, I think the total number of Ukrainian dead, if this fighting continues at this level of intensity, could approach easily 750,000 men, 750,000 men by the time this is done.
And it didn't have to be this way. at all. Scott, I was in the museum not a long time ago here in Moscow. If I pronounce it correctly, Museum of Modern History of Russia. And in that museum, there was a presentation of, the Second World War and the uniforms, all sorts of things. Very interesting museum. And there was a map. That map was showing the number of people and the regions of Russia as the Second World War was happening, how many of those people died, right? And I want to ask you this. Why do you think nowadays, because I believe I am a courageous person in my own way, you are a courageous person. Why nowadays not so many people you see that actually have courage? What's the reason?
Well, let's put it this way. And I think even some Russians will admit this. First of all, courage can't be assumed. There are a lot of people in peacetime who talk big, but when the first bullet's fired, run. So we don't know how people are going to respond to these kind of events. I was a firefighter, and there were a lot of guys who performed well in training, but the first time we had to go into a real structure fire where if we screwed up, we would die, they panicked and they left. Big in peace, little in war. And they're the guys that in peace were, you didn't think much of them. They were quiet. You didn't know, but when the big fire happened, they were right there going straight in, doing the job. You just never know how people are going to respond under stress. And I think you only find that out when you're tested, and it's not an immediate response. People hit, flight or fight, they talk about, am I going to run away or am I going to fight? And a lot of Soviets early on in the early days of World War II, on the front line and in the rear, weren't brave. A lot of soldiers surrendered. A lot of soldiers ran away. A lot of people avoided being called up. A lot of people shirked on their duties and responsibilities, didn't answer the call. But then what happens is, as the system is shocked, you quickly separate the wheat from the chaff. And the cowards and the shirkers, they are pushed aside and the heroes emerge. And cowardism, like heroism, is addictive. And what I mean is, if you surround yourself with people who run, the likely is that the herd mentality kicks in and you're going to run. But if you surround yourself with people who are standing up and fighting and showing that, you do that. And what happened in the Soviet Union is, early on, they had to separate the wheat from the chaff. But eventually, the wheat, the good people, stepped up. And all it takes is a few at first to step up and draw the line and say, I'm here. And then, because a lot of people that run aren't cowards, they're just people that are overwhelmed with uncertainty. They need an example. And when the example is set, a lot of the people who ran away will come back and say, no, I can fight, I'm here. And that happened. And the Soviet Union is an example that the world, especially those who talk about Russia today, these are the same people, same people. And we saw when Putin ordered mobilization, hundreds of thousands ran away, the chaff. But the people that stayed, don't mess with them. They're hard. And they're not hard in a cruel way. They're hard in the way that they're going to do what is necessary to get the job done. And they are literally these are the successors to the heroes of World War II. And the heroes of World War II aren't all heroic figures. Understand that heroism isn't somebody who runs forward and does amazing stuff. Most of the time, the people that run forward and do amazing stuff die. The heroes are the people who are scared, frightened, but they stand. They're so frightened, but they still do the job. They put the shell, put it in the gun, but they're scared to death. They hit it. They're not celebrating death. They're crying because of it. But they put one foot in front of the other and they do it. It's the person that gets up, they're hungry back in the town. They only have a loaf of bread. but they share that bread with somebody who needs the bread, and they go to work and they pay attention instead of shirking and making a mistake on a shell so that it misfires when that soldier needs it. They put the extra attention into making sure that the ammunition they produce works as required on the battlefield. And they do it although they're hungry. They do it although they have sick relatives and they're worried about their relatives. They do it although they don't live in great conditions. They do it although their life sucks at the moment. But those are the heroes that do it every single day because it's their duty, it's their responsibility. That's heroism. That's heroism. Heroism isn't, it's rare that you get the heroic figure. Those are very rare. Your real heroes are the average people who just do the task. And the Soviet Union and Russia is filled with average people, adequate people, not heroes in the classic sense. They're not Achilles and they're not the Greek warriors and all this stuff. They're just the average man and woman who, when it comes time to do the right thing, they do the right thing. And we don't give them the recognitions that they deserve. Historically, we in the West, we tend to bypass that. Do you know what it takes to have a nation lose 27 million people? Can you even begin to imagine the pain, the suffering? I talked about this in regards to Vladimir Putin because I've been doing some research exploring whether or not I want to write something about him. It's a big task, and you need to be adequate to the task before you take on a project of that nature. But he's talked about growing up in St. Petersburg and the impact that had on him and on his development. But what we fail to recognize is that, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, was a town under siege for over 900 days. 1 million people died of hunger, starvation. St. Petersburg, Leningrad is a hero city because the average people stepped up and did the job. His brother died. His father was wounded in the siege. His mother knew hunger, and the city was destroyed. And that's the city that Putin grew up in. And so you need to understand that when he talks about his childhood, we all are like, oh, he lived in a rough and tumble neighborhood. He lived in a neighborhood that had post-traumatic stress disorder. He lived in a nation that had PTSD, where everybody had lost somebody and they're struggling and trying to overcome the pain, the suffering to rebuild their lives. And he lived in that environment and it shaped who he is, but we don't respect it. We don't respect it. We don't sit there and say, that's real. Here in the United States, how come we can send off a guy to Afghanistan who does a single tour, maybe had 1 or 2 IEDs go off, shook his brain a little bit, saw some of his friends killed, but came home to a society, but he has PTSD, and he does. I'm not denigrating him, but we can respect that, but not respect a nation that was brutalized by Nazi occupation. 1 million people dead, people starving, dying, some reduced to cannibalism. They don't like to talk about that. People who were doing the most base things just to survive. And when they did survive, don't look back on their survival as heroic, but as the worst thing that ever happened to them, a nightmare that they want to forget, but they can't forget because the city's destroyed. They have to rebuild it, but the very process of rebuilding exposes them to the daily realities that they suffered. And they are insane people. It drives you insane. And yet they survived. They went on, but we don't respect that. We don't acknowledge that. In the United States, we ignore that aspect of it. We don't realize that Vladimir Putin is who he is because of what happened in World War II. 27 million people died. And if Vladimir Putin's affected that way, every Russian's affected that way. Every single one of them, which is why on Victory Day, they parade, the veterans are all dead. There's very few veterans still alive. But Russia as a society mobilizes with the Immortal Regiment, and they parade with the photographs of their loved ones. They will never forget, never forget. And we don't respect that. We don't respect that. And if you don't respect it, you don't know it. And if you don't know it, you will never understand it. This is why there's this gulf between the Russian people and the American people. It's a gulf created by ignorance. And the ignorance can only be broken if we actually take the time and opportunity to reach over and talk to them about this. One of the key aspects of recovering from PTSD is group therapy. You have people sit around and you have to give voice to that which is bothering you, so you don't keep it up bottled inside, so you don't commit suicide, you don't become an alcoholic, you don't become a drug addict, you don't abuse your wife, all this stuff. But you can only, if you keep it bottled up, you're going to lose that fight. In Russia's a nation where the grandparents of everybody who's alive today had PTSD. You had to. You could not have PTSD going through what they did. And anybody who lives again, we're learning this. If you have a father who went to war, came back broken, that the insanity of the father impacts the family, impacts the wife, impacts the kids. Kids, if the father's an alcoholic, the chances are the kids are going to be are alcoholics. And they then move on and it's transferred down in generations. Ask yourself today, you're in Moscow right now. When you walk the streets of Moscow, do you see a broken people?
I see very deeply feeling people.
Right, but they're not broken.
No, I see very strong people, but in a humble way, if this makes sense.
No, it makes, but why do you think they're that way? Because of their history.
Yes,
because of their
it's in their DNA. Absolutely.
It's part of their history. This is a nation of people that suffered so much beyond comprehension. And remember, it's not just that they suffered in World War II. As I said, recovering from World War II was itself traumatic. And then you throw on top of that the psychological trauma of Khrushchev's renunciation of Stalinism. So you have all that. Then you have the Brezhnev stagnation, which is also a traumatic thing in a lesser way, but still reflective of sort of a lethargy of society. Then you have Gorbachev's brief moment of failed revolution leading to the decade of the 1990s, which were as traumatic to the Russians as World War II was. What happened in the 90s, the psychological trauma of watching the Soviet Union collapse into a Russia that was being stomped down by the West, everything you believed in crumbling before your eyes was traumatic. And then they've recovered. And the process of recovery, though, is not automatic. It just doesn't automatically happen. It happens when heroes step up and say, we're going to take a step forward. We're going to do that which is necessary to recover, to rebuild, to grow, and all that. And the end result is the Russian people. I mean, I'm going to sound like, oh, Scott, you're in love with the Russian people. I am, actually. I mean, I'm an American, and anybody who pushes me as an American finds out I push right back. I love being American, proud of being an American. I'm not a Russian. I don't want to be a Russian. I want to be an American. But that doesn't mean that I can't respect and cherish and admire and love the Russian people. But you can only get to that point if you take the time to know them. And you can't get to know them unless you study their history in the full context of their history. And that means you have to get down into the weeds. You can't just say a rifle bullet was fired and it hit a body and the body died. One of 27 million. It's not that way. The trigger was pulled by a German who was indoctrinated into believing that the Russians were Slavic subhumans. He fired that bullet and it hit the father of a kid now who's going to be fatherless, but that kid is growing up in a village where the mother is being raped by German soldiers and the sister is being used as a sex slave and the uncle was sent off to slave labor and all this stuff. And then when the war is over, all of these broken pieces of humanity have come together and they have to try and recover, and they're stressed by Stalinism. And Stalin, in the later days, it did become a little bit oppressive, sort of a rebirth of the 30s. And then Khrushchev and the trauma of discovery of how, oh my God, bad things happened. And then you have Brezhnev and just sort of this lethargy of where are we going? What direction are we going in, et cetera. Gorbachev, there's some hope. There's no hope. Crushed. The 1990s. If you don't understand the human trauma that's attached to everything I just said, now that human trauma manifests itself physically and psychologically, then you'll never understand the Russian people today. Are they perfect? Hell no. They are disturbed people. You talk to some Russians and they've got some serious issues they need to work out, but they're working them out. They're working them out together. There's not a Russian I've met that says I'm perfect. Almost every Russian I've met acknowledges they've got some issues, but they're working on it. And their issues don't translate into abusing me or abusing others. Their issues are, I've got to do better. I've got to put one foot. I mean, that's the Russian way, man. That's what I love about them, because they don't sit there. There's no safe zone in Russia. In America, we got to have safe zones in colleges because, God, the little snowflakes might get a little upset because something happened they didn't like. You got to give them a safe zone so they can put a pacifier in their mouth and sit there and shake and cry and all this kind of stuff. There ain't no safe zone in Russia. Russia is a non-safe zone. It's real. It's as real as it gets. And the only way you survive in Russia is to get up in the morning, do that which you need to do to get ready for the day, and put one foot in front of the other. And in the process, you embark on a journey that you're joined by other people, and you appreciate one another. You recognize the same circumstances. Are they guilty of jealousy? Are they guilty of, yes, they're human beings. They're just like we are. But collectively, they're on a journey of making Russia a better country. And it is a better country. It's a country that has physically transformed itself from the 1990s into something that can't be recognized. And it's populated by a people that have so much heart, so much soul, that it just makes you cry.
Yes. And I say yes, because I came back because of this, I came back because of this. And if you would ask me a year ago where I will be now, I would never think that this would be the case. And I'm so glad I did, to experience it myself and see it and feel it. And no one will tell me what to think and how it is, because now I know, I've seen it. And I'm sure the more I come or the longer I stay, whatever the case, the more I will see. But to end on this, Kat, when you were talking about this, and I so agree with what you said, two things came to my mind. First is that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. That's how I feel. When you talk about those people who are not heroic, but they just show up and they do the right thing. And for me, the courage is not only like on the battlefield, but I mean the courage in everyday life to speak up, to say that you don't agree with the system, you don't agree with the BS that is being projected over and over and over again. That's courage too. I see like a lot of people are lacking this, lacking to even speak their own mind, Scott, to say that they don't agree with this, they don't believe in it. They just like, shaking their heads. And I wonder, like, how do they feel with themselves when they are like they are doing this against their own soul?
Yeah, you're talking about in the West primarily, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, like I said, I'm an American and I love my country, and we have so much potential, so much potential. We haven't been put through the same stresses as the Russian people, and I'm thankful. I'm thankful we have it. I don't want to have the Russian history. I'm glad we didn't have that. But because of that, and look, we do have parts of our society that have been traumatized. I mean, African Americans, you take a look at the plight of Mexican migrant workers. You take a look at the Appalachian poor, the white people in Appalachia, and what happens there. The Mississippi poor, the poor everywhere. The disconnect in American society between the haves and the have-nots and all this. There are people in America who have been traumatized significantly. But the difference is that they aren't given the chance to grow because they're treated as pariahs. They're treated as exceptions, not the rule. It's their fault, not my fault. They need to solve it. I don't need to solve it. I mean, unfortunately, that's what America's become, a nation of very selfish people who are, they mimic their government. And this is sort of, again, sort of a compliment to Russia. See, America, we believe that the whole world revolves around us, that we are the superpower. We are singularly blessed by God. I mean, look at Manifest Destiny, sort of the cornerstone of what made America what it is today, that God touched us to move from east to west, to conquer this country, to civilize this country. It meant to kill millions of Native Americans, but that's okay. They aren't really human. They're just Native Americans. It meant that in order to do this, we had to build an economic system that was based on the slave labor of millions of African Americans. It meant that we would go in and we would slaughter Mexicans to steal their land, to build our country greater. It meant all that, but we don't care because we were white people blessed by God to carry out God's will. And then once we reached California, we were blessed by God to continue to around the world. And now we Americans, and we say it, we don't even hide it. We are the exception. You know, the world needs us. Without us, the world can't function. We make the rules-based international order, which the world must comply with because we say so. And therefore, if that's our government's attitude, that translates down to we the people. So I am a sovereign citizen. I'm in my house. I care about my house. I want everything to revolve around me. If my power goes out, I'm on the phone to the electric company. Why aren't you repairing my power right now? If the road has a pothole, why aren't you fixing the pothole? Because of my inconvenience. Everything has to convenience me. And we've built a society that's based upon conveniencing the average blessed American. But for those who aren't blessed, they're an inconvenient. So I forget about them. As I drive to work in the morning, I ignore the cities of homeless out there, the cardboard boxes, the tents, the makeshift shelters. I just drive by it. There's a person there with a sign, "Feed me, I'm a veteran." Now, I'm the kind of idiot that actually stops and empties my wallet. But you know, as you get there, people are just driving by. And is emptying my wallet really solving his problems? No, he's probably a heroin addict. So he's going to take the money I gave him. He might go buy some coffee, but then he's going to go buy drugs, shoot up, be down in the bush, and the next day he's going to be back there at the sign saying the same thing. So me providing the money didn't solve anything, but it sure made me feel good for a minute saying, well, I did the right thing. Did I? Maybe doing the right thing isn't giving them money, but actually working to change the system so that we have a safety net for these people. But we can't because I'm all about me, because that's what my country is about, all about it. Let's look at Russia. Not perfect, but what's the Russian approach? It's about everybody. What can the government do for everybody? Not what, you know, not Russia doesn't want the world to revolve around Russia. Russia wants to be part of the world. Russia wants to be part of the community. And that mindset translates down to the Russian people, who say we are part of a community. You know, again, I'm not living there. I just know when I was there, you know, the babushka, and I know I said that wrong, and Russian linguists are, Scott, you got to say the word right. I apologize. But the grandmas, they looked out for everybody. I mean, I have little funny stories I tell about how they came out when I was playing soccer in minus 30-degree weather and literally grabbed me by the ear to bring me inside because I wasn't dressed properly. And they were chewing me out and yelling at me. And I'm like, I'm a weapons inspector here by treaty right. You can't hold me hostage like this. But they're like, you're not going out there until you're dressed warmly. You know, and then they always make sure you eat right and this, and they care about the kids. If a kid's out there, hey, you come here. Why are you doing that? You know, in America today, if we dare intervene with somebody else's kid, we get arrested for, you know, whatever. Russia seems to be a nation, a community that cares about its own people. It's not perfect. Are there mistakes? Yes. Is there corruption? Absolutely. Are there people who take advantage of people? Sure. They're humans. The human nature is that there will be a certain element among society that is maladjusted, that does bad things. That's why we have laws, you know, to hold people to account for violating the rules, to create a system that is fair for everybody. Is the Russian system perfect? Nope. Is it fair for everybody? It tries, but it's not perfect. But they're at least working at it, trying to say, we're trying to help everybody. We're a community of people. Whereas America, we're a community of one. We only care about ourselves. And now we take a look at activism, because activism is this way too. The reason why you can't get effective grassroots movements is because they can't agree on anything. They all have their own agendas, and their agendas are so pure because they alone count. I'm pro-gun. That's the only thing I care about is Second Amendment rights. I don't care about anything else. And if you don't agree on my interpretation of Second Amendment rights, you're the enemy. Okay, but now you're just a single issue person with a limited, limited impact. I'm pro-life. I'm pro-abortion. I'm this. I'm that. You can't get them to come together for anything, because the second they come together, it becomes a Tower of Babel. And they just speak in different languages and they fall apart. And this is a problem. I don't know about Russian civic organization. I don't know. I haven't been there for 30 years. So I can't tell you that the Russians are more capable in this than we are, except to say that I hear the Russians talking about the Russian soul. I hear Russians talking about the Russian character. I hear them talking about the Russian nation. So when they speak, they tend to speak in terms of inclusion. I very rarely hear a Russian talk about me, myself, and I. That doesn't.
But isn't it, Scott? Isn't it that exactly what you just said? This is what keeps the nation going.
Yeah.
This is exactly what keeps the nation alive and going.
Look, when I will say this, when I was a weapons inspector in Votkinsk, there was the Armenian earthquake, and it was horrible. A big earthquake in Armenia, and so the Armenian people who lost their homes were sent around to the Soviet Union to be brought in by different communities. And I remember, because we Americans were in this a complex that they had built for us, an apartment building, and they wanted us to move out and get to our permanent housing facility next to the factory, because they wanted to open this up for the Armenians who were coming in. They were trying to find homes for them. They did something they call a subotnik. It's like a worker's holiday, but basically what it is you work the day, but your labor for that day is put into a fund that is then used to help the Armenians. So they did a subotnik, and we inspectors participated in it. So basically that day, we took what we would have been paid that day, and we collected that money, and we gave it to we participated in this collective effort. But there was sincere effort to take care of these Armenians. I mean, a sincere effort to absorb them, to care. And I mean, people really cared about what happened in Armenia. They really cared, and they were thousands of miles away, but they cared. Here in the United States, we have East Palestine, Ohio. We have a train derailing there, a massive chemical cloud, and that's going to cause problems, and nobody cares. Everybody's just sort of ignoring it. Flint, Michigan has been suffering with contaminated water for years. I mean, it was an election issue back in 2016 and prior to that. They haven't fixed the water because we don't care. We don't care because it doesn't affect us. We only care about that which affects us. Whereas I just still believe that, Chernobyl was one of those stories that shows the worst about Soviet leadership and the best about the Soviet people. The fact that Chernobyl happened and et cetera, and the mistakes made, is a condemnation of the Soviet leadership. But how the Russian and Ukrainian people responded, the sacrifice they made to selflessly give of themselves to prevent an even larger disaster. I mean, my God, it's a story of average heroes, people who just did what needed to be done to get the job done. Nobody shirked. Nobody ran away. They needed literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of volunteers whose sole job it was, you were brought in to do one thing and one thing only, and that is climb up several flights of stairs, put on some shielding, and run out and remove some heavily contaminated graphite in a period of time that you had to come back or you're going to die. And you absorbed so much radiation that was it. That's all you were allowed to absorb, go home. And much of that radiation you absorbed, even though they tried to calculate it so it wouldn't be fatal, meant you got cancer years later and you died. And they did it. They did it without question because it was the right thing to do for the community, for the collective. I see that's a big disconnect here at home. I just see Americans not and there's always the exception. You have groups that do care. You have people that pour their heart and souls into community projects, trying to make things better. But they're in isolation. They're the exception, not the rule. We don't come together as a country the way I've seen Russia come together on issues like this.
Thank you so much for today's cut. We went over the time. I'm actually like, oh my goodness, you will be late for your other interview probably. I'm so sorry, Scott.
Before they'll have to forgive me.
They have to forgive you, Scott. Please tell everyone who's watching, because we don't really talk about it much, but the best way to support you, besides buying the book, which the links will be down below the video. What is the best way?
The best way to support.
Yes.
There's two ways you can support me. One is financially, and that is you go to scottritterextra.com. My Substack is there, and you can subscribe to Substack, and that is a tremendous support. It takes a lot of pressure off of me, etc. But it's not required. I don't have a paywall. You don't have to do that. And I understand there's people out there that are struggling and and can't. I get it. And then what I say is, please access everything I put on there anyways, because it shows that you have a hunger for knowledge and information. Then the way you can support is by getting involved in your communities, by supporting veterans, by supporting the homeless. And later on this year, when I ask you to come to New York City in June of 2024 and be part of a 1 million-person movement to put arms control back on the agenda for American politicians so we save the world. So if you don't want to donate money, then at least give me a day. When I ask you, please come to New York City, or please come to whatever location we're going to hold a supporting rally, show up, be part of the numbers that are telling our government yes to arms control, yes to nuclear arms reduction, yes to peaceful coexistence with Russia. That's how you could support me.
Thank you so much. I think we have to dedicate entire show to this.
I am committed, and I'd be more than happy to talk to you about it in more detail.
I know many of the viewers will be there. I'm absolutely certain. Scott, thank you again so much for your time, extra time actually, today.
Okay.
And thank you everyone for watching. You find all the links down below the video that Scott mentioned, also to his books as well. Thank you, guys.